She came to the mall hoping for family, and for once she had dressed as if it might be a real celebration. Under the canopy of holiday lights, Astrid sat on a bench that lined the central atrium, a sketchbook closed on her lap like a shield. The strings of bulbs overhead blinked in steady, careless patterns. Voices braided into one another around her, laughter, the scrape of shopping carts, a chorus of small, bright sounds she felt in other people's bodies rather than heard, chests lifting and falling, mouths forming words she could read if she watched. To everyone else, it was music and holiday cheer. For Astrid, it was a scene of motion and color that held a hollow place where sound should have been. She had been 19 the night her hearing left, not 14, she corrected herself. No, 14. The date had etched itself into memory as sharply as the ridge of a pencil. She remembered hospital corridors and the way people's faces went soft with sympathy. Later, there was the clumsy, awkward silence at family dinners when forks clinked and no one checked whether she could follow the conversation. She had learned to read mouths and signs, to build life out of what she could see. She learned to listen with her eyes. Tonight, her family was supposed to meet her beneath the giant fir in the mall center. Instead, a curt message lit up her phone that morning. "Can't make it. Family emergency. Sorry." No explanation, no attempt to reschedule. The thread of plans frayed in her hands like thin twine. She kept the certificate tucked inside her coat pocket anyway. It was there, pressed flat against her ribs, an embossed seal, the line that read, "First place, International Illustration Prize." She had won something real, something that belonged to her, something she had wanted to show them so badly. She had wanted her sister to see it, to be proud. Pride tasted strange in her chest now, sharp and guarded. She smoothed the fabric over the paper without pulling it out. Her fingers remembered the night the acceptance email had come, how she had stared at the screen until her eyes blurred with unshed tears. In the month since, the same hands that sketched had learned to write in block letters for strangers, to leave crisp notes for teachers, to sign in neat, economical gestures when someone met her halfway. She liked to think of her art as another language, lines and color doing the speaking she could not always command. A child appeared beside her bench like a small comet. Audrey's coat was too bright for the winter sky, cobalt blue with a hood trimmed in synthetic fur, and the girl's mittens were mismatched, one striped and one plain. She watched Astrid with the kind of attention adults mistook for curiosity and dismissed. The child's face was intent, brows knitted, as if she were reading an interesting page. Audrey tugged at the sleeve of the man beside her. The man, thin, polite, hair a shade of brown that had begun to silver at the temples, turned. He followed the direction of the little hand and saw Astrid. "She looks lonely," Audrey signed, earnest and forceful. Then added, clumsily, towards aloud too, because she liked to make sure grown-ups heard, "Daddy, can we sit with her?" The man's smile was the kind that had room for other people's stories. He bent to Audrey's height and framed his response with slow, generous signs. "Okay, come, be nice," translated into gentle English for the benefit of the bustling crowd. He had the careful habits of someone who had parented through patient repetition. His name was Henry Corbin, and he knew a small vocabulary of signs from a job years ago that required him to be mindful. He wasn't fluent, but he had learned what mattered: his daughter's needs, the difference between a yes and a no, the way to make people feel seen. Audrey walked over, then stopped, deciding at the last second to attempt more. She signed hello to Astrid, her hand flapping with earnest, theatrical movement. Astrid's eyes lifted. The greeting was both awkward and plain, and, because it was offered without expectation, it landed with a quiet warmth. Astrid read the little girl's face. She watched the shape of Audrey's lips, the way her hands made a birds-like flutter. For a beat, she hesitated. Social gestures from strangers felt like shallow things when everything else had been heavy with disappointment. The bench felt suddenly exposed, as if everyone could see how small she had left herself. Henry caught the hesitation. He smiled and, with a practiced slowness designed to be clear, signed a phrase he had used once before with a woman at a community center. "Come have dinner. You're welcome." His fingers were careful and plain. He didn't do poetry with the motion. He did the honest work of making an offer visible. He added words, spoken enough to reassure his daughter and anyone watching. "We're just going to grab a quick dinner. Want to come with us?" Astrid's lips parted in a ghost of a laugh. Invite after invite had become a pattern, the kind that arrived with cones of obligation and then folded away. Her sister's messages, thin strings of text that read as if from someone who had already left the room, made her suspicious of kindness that came from blood. But the girl's bright face, the father's manner, the way he didn't look away from her hands when he signed, these things mattered more than she had expected. She dug a pen and a small pad from her bag, the same pad she used to capture ideas and jokes people told in passing. Her handwriting was neat and considered. She wrote, plain across the page, "Thank you. I will." She placed the paper where Henry could see it and held up a hand to sign back in the slow, careful way she used with people she was teaching. Her fingers formed a phrase that was not flashy. "I accept." It felt like a treaty. Audrey whooped like a tiny bell and tugged at Henry again, pulling him as if to say, "See, you did something good." Henry wrapped an arm around his daughter and lifted his other hand to touch Astrid's in the brief, respectful way of strangers becoming allies. The contact was light but real. It said, without words, "We will go somewhere warm and sit and be somewhere safe for a little." If this moment feels like the sort of small kindness the world needs more of, share it with someone who cares. A single gesture can shift a life. They moved through the mall together, an accidental trio threading past storefronts where mannequins wore glitter and sale signs glinted. Astrid walked with a measured gait, a sketchbook tucked beneath her arm. Henry kept a slight angle of attention toward her, watching for the small signals she habitually gave when she needed to be included. A glance, a nod, a hand raised. Audrey chattered without sound to Astrid, forming words with her mouth and smacking her fist to her cheeks when she laughed, a kid's mime to match the silence that wrapped Astrid's world. The level of comfort between the three grew in increments. Henry would sign a phrase and then say it, like a translator teaching a phrase to a student. "Hot chocolate," he mouthed, signing slowly, and Audrey squealed. Astrid's mouth curved. She knew the routine, the ritual of small pleasures. She had been in plenty of rooms where food and drink were the currency of connection. She had, in other places, traded sandwiches for a short conversation. This felt easier. This felt chosen. They settled at a small cafe by the fountain. Cups steamed in front of them in theatrical clouds. For Astrid, steam was a kind of sound, visible, billowing. Henry placed a cup for her, and, as they waited, Audrey pulled out a little paper ornament she had made in school, a looped star of paper with scribbles and glue. She pushed it toward Astrid, then signed, "Proud, made for you." Astrid traced the edges with her fingertips. She didn't feel pity or pity's cousin, gratitude. She felt instead the simple barter of being seen. She put the ornament in her pocket like a talisman. When the lights flickered, it was a stuttering echo from the ceiling, a visible shiver. The music that had been a halo around the fountain turned into a cluster of frozen mouths. People paused mid-laughter. Then the same bulbs that had blinked with programmed cheer fell dark. The mall reacted like a living thing that had suddenly lost its heart. A ripple of movement spread. The crowd shifted. Announcements that would have been calm orders to leave or instructions to gather swelled into a mess of hurried mouths and raised voices that Astrid could not catch. Her world contracted. She set her cup down with too much force. The ceramic clinked, a sound she did not hear but felt as a tremor under her palm. Her lungs shortened. Panic rose the way it did when visibility failed on a road, tight and sudden. There were no auditory cues to scaffold what was happening, no alarms, no authoritative voice to read lips from a distance, no directional cues. The only cues were hands and faces, and the tremor of bodies in motion. Henry saw the change as if from the corner of a room. He had lived with a child who ran at the sight of opportunity, and with the knowledge that public places could become dangerous when power failed. He reached for Astrid before she could look for a door. His fingers closed at her elbow with a steadying pressure that said, "I have you." He signed rapidly toward her, "Hold my arm, follow me, keep close." His movements were utilitarian and urgent. Astrid met his gaze. His face held a concentrated calm that seemed to push against the panic like a hand on a glass. She tightened her grip around her sketchbook as if it were an anchor and let him guide her to her feet. Audrey grabbed her other hand, small fingers like a rope. The mall transformed into a maze of silhouettes. Store windows became pools of darkness, reflecting anxious eyes. Security lights flashed intermittently, white and harsh. People surged, because when the unknown arrives, bodies tend to move toward perceived exits and away from congestion. Astrid's vision thinned at the edges. Her world went from broad panorama to narrow tunnel. She read the lips of the people nearest her. Go out, this way, no, wait, words that came in fragments and failed to cohere. Short sentences took over in her head. Get out, stay close, breath, don't run. Henry's hand was a constant. He pulled firmly but without haste. He moved like someone leading a child across ice, slow, careful, anticipating slips before they happened. He didn't shout commands he knew Astrid couldn't hear. He didn't try to calm by voice. He used touch and the language of the visible. When a man in a dark jacket pushed past them without looking, Henry placed himself between the man and Astrid, then set his palms on the man's chest with a soft but firm gesture that translated to, "Not for you, find another way." His sign was not rude, it was bordered with civility and intent. A security guard blocked their way at one corridor. In the half-light, the guard's breath drew a white cloud. His hands were gloved. He barked orders into the air, words chopped and hard. Astrid could not lip-read the guard from where she stood, and his gestures were part performance and part confusion. The guard's body language implied the need to move faster. Crowds leaned around them. Something in the press of people nudged Astrid's chest with the intimacy of a new acquaintance. Her palms went slick with the damp of adrenaline. Henry took her other hand. He signed again with less flourish, more insistence. Now, out this way, and then, I will help you. He touched his own chest, then pointed at her, then at the exit. His hands were both translator and promise. Astrid felt the steadiness of his fingers, the warmth of his touch as the current under her own flayed nerves. It settled something. They descended toward the parking garage in a wet, swirling mass. The same functional light that had saved them in the mall was thin under concrete. The parking lot was a river of taillights and sloshing boots. Henry guided them to their car, close to where his compact hatchback had waited, with a stubborn halo of snow still clinging to the rear window. His hands moved with a fatherly economy. Unlock, lift, guide. Gestures designed to map safety in the minute architecture of protection. A car horn sounded somewhere behind them. People shouted. A woman cried. Astrid's chest hitched. The world kept throwing itself forward. The roads outside had begun a steady descent into white. A blizzard had been forecast, but the storm had arrived sooner, unannounced and meaner than weather forecasts. Snow fell like white noise, a dense visual curtain that reduced distance. Street lamps glowed with halos. Grime and ice had already congealed across travel surfaces. Henry pulled the car into traffic like a man threading a needle. He drove with the caution of someone who had taught a child to value small, safe choices. The car moved slow, too slow for some drivers, and a frustrated pickup threaded past them like a predator. The lanes shimmered. At one turn, a slick patch hissed under the tires. The back of the vehicle fishtailed. Short sentences. She saw the world slide. Lights swung. Snow became a smear. The car spun. Astrid's knuckles were white against the armrest. Her breath caught in small, sharp pieces. Henry's hands were a study in calm. He kept them on the wheel, slight adjustments, a murmur of movement that kept them from losing everything. His eyes flitted between the road and Astrid. He signed once, slow and clear, from the angle of his wrist, his fingers forming the single imperative no one needed air for. Breathe. He mouthed it silently as if to teach her that he was the voice when there was none. The car shuddered and then righted. A hard shove along the shoulder of the road deposited them in a shallow bank as a truck whooshed past, tires kicking a gray rooster tail. The world outside was a painting with smeared charcoal edges. They sat for a breath or several, engines ticking as metal cooled. And then Henry opened the door against the battering wind and helped them out. He was dirtied by snow along one sleeve. He kept movement precise, a choreography that avoided panic. Astrid's body trembled. The sketchbook had come undone and lay on the seat between them, edges fluted with damp. She crouched to gather it with the habitual motion of someone who repairs small things to retain control. Henry bent with her, touching the small of her back for a second, a confidential and brief pressure. It was not affectionate in a romantic way. It was human contact that said, "You are still here." They decided not to drive further. The roads were veiled and dangerous. Henry cursed once, soft and brief, then signed to Audrey with the tired patience of the parent of a child on the cusp of sleep. Plan B. My place. Quick. Warm. The girl dragged her free mitten over her neck and nodded, the kind of acceptance kids make when plans morph into adventure. The walk to Henry's apartment was an exercise in small, considerate movement. Snow pelted their faces like 1,000 tiny taps. The city around them had become a muffled watercolor of lit shop windows and boots that scuffed. People passed with hunched shoulders and eyes that avoided the direct stare of others, as if privacy could be tucked into a coat. At one point, someone tripped on the stairs, and Henry extended a hand without looking away from Astrid, making sure she had safe footing. His attentiveness felt deliberate, not dramatic. She watched his interactions. He greeted the doorman with a formal nod of recognition, and then, without fuss, keyed the elevator for them. The apartment smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something bready, like a memory of hospitality. There was a threadbare rug in the small entryway, and a hand-lettered calendar on the wall with dates circled in pencil. Audrey ran across the living room, leaving wet footprints like punctuation. Inside, the apartment was modest but not spare. There was a small tree in the corner, its lights dimmed to conserve electricity, ornaments clustered from the years Henry and Audrey had collected. A soft glow from a lamp and a cluster of votive candles gave the room a washed amber intimacy. The heater hummed. It was the kind of domestic noise Astrid could not hear but could feel in the air, the slow warmth moving like a hand through the space. There were framed prints on the walls, landscapes, a photo of Henry and a younger woman at a beach, Audrey squinting against sunlight. Nothing about the room shouted wealth. Everything about it suggested an economy of care, decisions made slowly and for good reasons. Audrey began a ritual at once. She dragged a box of mismatched ornaments toward the couch and started arranging them with solemn deliberation. Henry set mugs on the table, made a show of knocking sugar into them, and then left to check the small oven. Astrid sank onto the sofa like a stone, falling into a calm pond. She let herself look at the shapes of the room, the way light smoothed the edges of ordinary things. For the first time in hours, she let her shoulders drop. She pulled the certificate from her pocket then, because light under the lamp made the seal sparkle. She hesitated a beat, the way one hesitates before showing someone a private thing. Then she laid it on the coffee table with a small, decisive gesture, smoothing the corner with a fingertip. Henry glanced over. Audrey stopped mid-arrangement and peered. Henry's eyebrows rose, a quiet recognition. He leaned in and read the embossed lines with slow, respectful attention, the way a person reads a book they mean to remember. In the warm yellow lamplight, the letters were as bold as they had been in the acceptance email. First place, International Illustration Prize. Astrid watched their faces. If she feared pity, she did not get it. She got something simpler. Astonishment followed by an uncomplicated human clap from Audrey, light and delighted. Wow, Henry signed too, in the small, precise signs he'd used before. He mouthed it afterward. That's incredible. She felt the easing of her ribs in a way that was unmoored from the night's chaos. It was a small vindication. Not a cure or a miracle, but a proof that the things she made could be seen and celebrated outside the private libraries of her own head. Audrey tightened a tiny paper star into Astrid's hand and announced, silently and with the majesty of a decree, that now they were all going to make a proper ornament display. She darted to the tree and started enacting a plan, climbing and stumbling, her mittens leaving faint arcs of wet as she maneuvered. Astrid found herself smiling. Laughter rose up like the first breath after a long hold. It was small and shy, but real. Henry stood near the kitchenette and pulled out a notepad and pen, one of those cheap spiral pads kept for grocery lists. He slid it across to Astrid and wrote in large, clear letters, "If you want, you can stay the night. No pressure, just shelter." Astrid read it. Her fingers touched the paper. The house smelled of cinnamon and something warm and alive. Outside the window, snow had tapered to a hush. The city's distant lights glittered like an audience. She didn't move to say yes, because decisions mattered, and her history had taught her to guard them. She lifted the pen and wrote back in the same deliberate hand, "I don't want pity." She paused, then added, "I want to decide where I sleep." Henry read and nodded, as if he understood the sentence in another language, one constructed of hard-earned boundaries and unadorned dignity. He crossed his own arms against the winter and signed, slow enough to be clear, "We respect your choice." Audrey, who had been distracted by an ornament in danger of falling, spun around and signed with all the theatricality she possessed. "Make it official, Aunt Astrid!" Her impromptu title had no legal weight, but it was heavy with warmth. Astrid found herself laughing outright now, the soundless mirth visible in the line of her mouth and the crinkle of her eyes. They sat quietly for a while, hands moving in the comfortable small talk of people who had not planned to create a household tonight. The television in Henry's apartment had a paused screen of commercial images, faces mouthed without sound, and Audrey held a cushion. The night outside was a quilt. The worried part of the city had unstitched itself into long, white seams. The three of them made a small island of light and slow gestures. Astrid turned the certificate over in her hands, tracing the embossed edges with the pads of her thumbs. The paper felt like a hinge between two rooms in her life, the one she'd left and the one she might build. Beside the seal, in a small rectangle of print she had not read aloud before, was a line naming the judging committee and a short sentence of praise for clarity of vision and narrative strength. She had always been reluctant to narrate her own work. Tonight, in the warmth of a stranger's apartment that felt less and less like a stranger's, she allowed herself to be seen by two people who didn't have the right to her past, but who had given themselves to the present. Outside, the wind rose again. The window pane rattled faintly, as if someone were knocking in Morse code. If the night had been a long, hard test, they had passed the first section. But Astrid's life had its deeper tests, sisterly coldness, a family that equated her differences with shame. The certificate did not erase the messages she had received that afternoon, the small ways a family could injure without ever raising a hand. It did not, she knew, make bridges where years of indifference had eroded them. Still, for the first time that night, she felt a small permission to believe that some dangers could be kept at bay by simple human kindness. Henry moved in the kitchen, stirring something that made the room smell like home. Audrey performed a final placement of ornaments, stepping back to admire the tree. Astrid reached for her sketchbook and opened it. Inside, a page waited with a half-finished drawing. A woman under a canopy of lights, hands upraised, not in prayer, but in the peculiar, eloquent language of artists, gesture as meaning, line as confidence. She began to draw again, the motion slow and faithful, her pencil tracing the arc of a hand. Her world had been reshaped tonight at the margin by a man who knew just enough signing to make an offer, and by a child who tugged at sleeves without thinking of convention. The gesture had changed everything she thought about where she belonged. A crease in the door's paint signaled someone arriving downstairs. They heard steps, boots, a muffled argument, a voice that hit the room like a stone. The room froze in the small, bright way rooms do when the weather outside is angry and the weather inside is calm. Astrid felt a tightening, not the same as the panic in the mall, but a different knot, older and more complicated. Her past was knocking at the door. Henry's hand stilled on the kettle. He looked at Astrid with a question he had not yet formed into language. Audrey's face went still, the buoyant light in her eyes dimming to a watchful shine. In the threshold of Henry's apartment, snow fell and made a silver hesitation on the mats. The door swung open. A woman stood there, framed by the harsh white outside. Her coat was too smart for the weather, as if she had planned to be seen rather than to shelter. Her face was polished with the economy of someone who had not asked for help in a long time. She scanned the room, and the glance that caught Astrid's face was all the cold, shuttling lines of a ledger. She carried words like a ledger, kept accounts of wrongs and disappointments, and she knew how to demand a return on investment. Amanda's mouth moved before the rest of her did. A sentence unlatched and landed in the air like a cold coin. Astrid's fingers tightened around the pencil. The line she had been drawing curved, then paused. The warmth of the lamp felt thin in the face of the woman at the door. The apartment had been an island. Amanda's arrival threatened to sweep its edges. Henry rose, not hurriedly, but with an even courtesy. He put himself, without drama, without theatrics, between the doorway and the room's small tableau. Astrid set the pencil down. Audrey huddled closer, a child forming a human shield with her small body. The woman's eyes flicked over Audrey, the tree, the certificate on the table. Her glance paused over the certificate with an unreadable flicker of recognition, an expression Astrid had encountered before, a combination of dismissal and the proprietorship of disappointment. Amanda's shoulders tightened. Something about her told Astrid she would prefer to extract shame from the scene than show pride for the accomplishment sitting inert on the coffee table. Words followed, crisp and edged. Henry's mouth formed something as he tried to translate the woman's sharpness into the soft grammar of calm. Astrid read lips, heart in her throat. The woman's expression did not seek to understand. It sought to reclaim what she believed was owed. The room narrowed again, not from outside danger, but from the pressure of past accounts settling. Astrid's hands moved to her lap. There was a decision to be made, not about the certificate this time, but about what she would allow in her life. The air felt charged with all the small towns where she had been told, explicitly or in passing, that she did not fit neatly into the family ledger. She met Henry's gaze. He waited for her to shape the answer with the quiet generosity of someone who had offered shelter and would respect a refusal if it came. He did not rush her. For the first time that night, Astrid had the space to choose without the pressure of the mall's floodlights or the car spill. The woman at the door, her sister, kept talking, and the words streaked across Astrid like sleet. Astrid's pencil hovered over a blank page in the sketchbook. Her voice, when she made it, would not be loud. It would be the precise, deliberate thing of someone used to making herself heard in other ways. She put her hand over her certificate as if laying a palm on a fragile relic and signed a single thought, slow and steady, in plain, practiced motion. I will decide. Astrid's fingers finished the sign before the room had time to lean in and interpret it. The sentence hung in the air, plain and unadorned. I will decide. Amanda's mouth tightened into a line that meant calculation rather than concern. She stepped forward as if proximity could undo the lamp's amber permission. Her words came clipped, practiced, sharp enough to cut the edges off the intimacy in the room. You can't stay here like this, Amanda said, as if the sentence were itself a rule of physics. Her breath fogged the doorway. We had plans. Our family doesn't live like this. People will talk. Her eyes flicked to the certificate, then back to Astrid, not looking like the sister Astrid had once known, but like someone examining a ledger and finding an unwanted entry. You always make scenes, she added, as if that explained everything. Astrid felt the old ache, small humiliations stacked until they built a wall. She could trace the architecture of it on her skin. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She signed, deliberate, each stroke clean as a line in a drawing. You hurt me before. Tonight isn't about your comfort. The motion was steady. Her hand did not shake. If anything, it was steadier than her voice had ever been in arguments where words failed rather than aided her. Amanda's face shifted, impatient and quick. "This is ridiculous," she said aloud, unbothered by the fact that Astrid might not hear it. She reached, in a smooth movement that wore entitlement like an overcoat, for the certificate on the coffee table. Her fingers hovered over it. Henry moved without the drama of heroics. He stepped in with the same kind of quiet economy he used to keep Audrey's fingers from pinching too hard. Hands firm, not theatrical. "Please," he said softly. And then, because the world still wanted literal language, he wrote on a spare page and held it up. "Please respect her. She's a guest." Amanda's hand froze. She looked at the note as if it might have been a summons. Then, with a swallow of irritation, she pivoted and addressed Audrey like an afterthought. "Come with me, Audrey," she said in the clipped tone adults used when they meant to reclaim a child as part of their argument. "We're going now." Audrey's smile slipped, the kind that leaves a child's eyes too quickly. She watched Amanda's face and then the room. The child read the small politics like an open map. Without pretense, she signed to Astrid. "You okay?" Her hands were taut with worry. Henry's jaw softened. He looked at Astrid and mouthed, gently, "Do you want him to go?" Astrid shook her head. She had been building toward this moment for years, rehearsing refusals, deciding which parts of herself she would trade to keep peace. She had learned with the wary patience of someone who had navigated closed doors before that yes could be a debt. She would not incur another. Amanda's anger rolled outward like winter wind. "You need to come home," she insisted. "This is humiliating for the family. This little stunt." Her hand swept, indicating the tree, the imperfect ornaments, the certificate. "Makes us look bad." Astrid's throat tightened. There was a tired autobiographical rhythm to this, the sister as arbiter of propriety, Astrid as the family wrinkle to be ironed away. She wrote, large and unflinching, "I am not a stunt. I have a life." The room hummed with that small, brittle silence that follows a truth said plainly. Amanda's face slackened then, as if she had been forced to listen to a recording of herself and could not bear the sound. She grabbed her coat collar and said, "Fine, stay, but don't explain this to anyone." The words had the cool cruelty of someone who wanted to maintain control by withholding affection. She turned on her heel and left as if the apartment were a stage she was exiting from. Snow tracked into the hallway behind her, a thin, wet ribbon. The door closed with the kind of finality that belonged more to locked crates than to family thresholds. In the silence that followed, Astrid allowed herself to feel the relief. Sharp, incongruous, almost guilty. Amanda's posture of outrage had been familiar, but it had been hers to carry. Tonight, Astrid found that she no longer needed to shoulder it. Audrey sagged, the child version of a long breath. Henry exhaled too, slowly, the way someone lets air out after holding it to steady a hand. He touched Astrid's shoulder in a quick, respectful way that said, "You did well. You chose." They settled back into the lamp's glow. The tree continued to blink with the slow indifference of small lights. Outside, the storm traded its fury for a hush. The city compressed into muffled shapes. For the next hour, the apartment lived in ordinary acts. Henry scraped chocolate into mugs with a tiny, satisfying sounds, grating, stirring, sliding. Audrey performed a solemn ceremony of arranging cookies on a plate and offering the first to Astrid with both hands, a coronation of crumbs. Astrid accepted, fingers brushing the child's and feeling warmth spread like ink across paper. She wrote on a new page, "Thank you, for tonight." She folded the note and gave it to Henry. He read it and tucked it into his pocket, like saving a receipt. He smiled in a way that meant both gladness and private relief. They talked around things they could not say aloud. Henry told them, by gesture, then by writing, small facts about himself. He worked at a local library, he had taken a course where he learned to sign the basics, he had once been married, briefly. In a photograph he gestured toward on the shelf, where a woman and a child squinted into the sun. He did not elaborate. He didn't have to. The silence between the words was not empty. It was a shared place where the three of them could deposit small truths without being trampled by judgment. Audrey demanded, in all the ways children demand, that Astrid teach her to draw. She sat cross-legged on the rug and watched as Astrid sketched the woman from the half-finished page, giving the lines to the child one by one. Astrid showed Audrey how to draw a hand. Start with a simple block, bend the fingers like petals. Audrey's fingers clumsily copied the motion, tracing the hinge of a thumb with the exaggerated care of someone learning to use a new language. Her paper filled with enthusiastic, lopsided hands. Later, Audrey dozed, curled in a small ball on the couch, her mittened hands tucked under her chin. The television flickered in silent commercials. The heater sighed. Henry folded 2 blankets across the couch and then moved quietly to make a little bed on the floor for Astrid. He left a mug of chocolate cooling on the table and a small lamp lit by the tree bulbs. Astrid thought of the certificate and then of the thinness of the comfort that had once tied her to Amanda. That weight lifted in ways she could not immediately name. She lay on the floor, head cushioned by a throw pillow, and watched the sketched hands she'd left on the page. They seemed to breathe. A small, private laughter came out of her chest, soundless and full. At some point between the low lamplight and the soft, even sound of Audrey's breathing, Astrid was awake enough to feel the shape of decisions settle into flesh. Henry had written earlier on a pad, "You can stay. No strings, no rush." He had folded the paper and placed it where she would find it in the night, a small lighthouse on a coffee table. She kept it in her palm a long while, feeling the weight of it. It was not a grand promise. It was an offer of hospitality. It came without clauses or obligations. It was the kind of thing that, in the arithmetic of ordinary life, counted for more than speeches. When morning threaded pale blue through the curtains, streetlight halos dimmed into a clean, cold clarity. Audrey woke early, as children do when rooms have new lights, and the world smells like possibility. She padded to the tree and rummaged in a small shoebox until she uncovered a pair of gloves, child-sized, made from mismatched wool, one thumb still crooked from hurried stitching. She had worked on them in the slow hours the night before, under a lamp, stitching with the solemn concentration of an artist. She pressed them into Astrid's hands like a crown. "For you," she signed, and her mouth shaped the words the way someone shaping clay shapes meaning. The gloves were imperfect. One palm had a nick near the seam, the yarn puckered where enthusiasm outran skill. They were warm. Astrid slid them on. They fit like a small promise. Her stomach eased in a way that made her eyes prick. Henry emerged from the bedroom carrying 3 paper plates and a thermos of coffee. He sat and wrote on the pad with the same careful handwriting he used for grocery lists and gentle reminders. He slid the paper toward Astrid. On it were 2 lines. "If you want more than tonight, no pressure. You're welcome to stay as long as you need while you make plans. We won't interfere. We'll help where we can." Astrid read it twice. The sentence was generous in its brevity. She felt gratitude that was not the sticky, indebted kind she had known with family members who loved conditionally. This gratitude was clear and level. She considered logistic things, Phone calls, the email she'd been evading about the prize, a landlord who expected rent. There were practicalities. There were also the invisible calculations of dignity and privacy. She uncapped the pen and wrote, "I will stay while I find a place. I am not asking for a favor. I am asking for time." Henry nodded as if he understood the grammar of the request. He wrote back 2 words, and then, beneath them, a little drawn cup of coffee. More than the literal object, it was a symbol. 2 words, of course. Audrey grinned and signed, emphatic, "Official Aunt Astrid." She then, in the earnest way of children who believe words make facts, marched to the phone and dialed her mother, Amanda's number, intending perhaps to report a truth, to tell of a holiday that had found its own pulse. She hung up before the call connected. It seemed then that some things were better left to be discovered rather than broadcast like gossip. They ate breakfast in a cozy, companionable silence. There was talk, gestures and notes about the prize, about what Astrid's work meant, about the judging committee's comments that had glowed on the acceptance letter. Henry listened with a rocking attentiveness, as if each sentence was a small, precious thing to be examined. Audrey chimed in with the kind of enthusiastic, literal interpretations children parrot back from overheard facts, and the 3 of them laughed in a way that filled the room with a sound Astrid could see in the curl of mouths. Mid-morning, when the city outside gleamed wet and forgiving, Henry and Astrid sat at the coffee table with the certificate between them. He asked, by sign, by notepad, by patient waiting, if she wanted him to contact anyone for her. Publisher, gallery, the person managing the prize. Astrid hesitated. The prize opened doors and also exposed a life to scrutiny. She had won something that carried attention with it. She valued both the recognition and the right to receive it on her own terms. She wrote slowly, "I want to tell them myself, but thank you for offering." Henry made a small face that meant, "I understand." He then wrote a list of possible practical next steps: contact details for an agent friend, the number of a community studio that rented desk space by the month, a local advocacy center that helped people navigate workplace forms and accommodations. He did not push. He offered scaffolding, not instructions. Astrid felt a subtle, steady warmth building inside her chest that had nothing to do with the literal heat in the apartment. The warmth had the texture of being seen without negotiation. It had the sound of a small bell Audrey had pressed in her hand the night before and had set alight in Astrid's days. There was one scene they did not plan for: Amanda's return with a quieter, colder intent. She stood at the threshold again, but this time her anger had been replaced by a posture of calculation, less theatrical, more surgical. She held a manila envelope, letters peeking like teeth. Her face had the pale, tight look of someone who wanted to pick a fight at the most advantageous minute. "I've talked to Mom," she said, flipping the statement like a coin. "She thinks it's fine if you stay in the city while you try to get your head together. But you can't put this on us." She nodded toward the certificate as if it were proof that Astrid's accomplishments made demands of the family. Astrid folded her hands and wrote, "Mom can't decide for me. I choose." Amanda's lower lip twitched, an almost animal movement. "You always make choices that inconvenience people," she said. "You choose drama." She paused, and then, quieter, almost pleading, "We could have helped." Astrid felt something like pity, not for Amanda, but for the way she'd been corroded by her own expectations. She answered without noise, "You didn't help. You left words when help would have been needed." The sentence was clean. It did not wrap itself in accusation so much as statement. Amanda's shoulders sagged. The hard armor of the earlier confrontation softened into a tiredness that suggested she had argued on many stages and always expected to win by repetition. "You're ridiculous," she said at last, in a voice that tried to salvage superiority. "I hope this arrangement with them isn't permanent." "It's for now," Astrid wrote. She added, slowly, "and if it becomes something more, I will decide then." Amanda's face registered a small, sharp frustration. She had no leverage. She was used to being the family gatekeeper. Tonight, her role had been quietly reclaimed by Astrid's refusal. Amanda left again, the door clicking behind her. The sound seemed final, in a way that carried no triumph. When the apartment's warm light settled in again, Henry sat back and traced his thumbs together. He said something aloud, softly, about how he'd always believed family could be chosen as well as born. He signed the sentence too, for Audrey's benefit and for Astrid's. Family, he signed slowly, is the people who show up. It was a truth the night had taught Astrid the hard way. It was a lesson that came without the sting of moralizing. It arrived as a fact. The people who show up are the people who hold the ropes while you climb. The days that followed were quiet and practical in ways that built trust. Henry walked Astrid through small bureaucracies, how to respond to emails professionally when her heart felt like a fist, what to say to curators, how to accept congratulations without feeling the prick of exposure. He introduced her, with a pound of cultural modesty, to a friend at the library who ran a small exhibit and had once sponsored local artists. The friend, an even-tempered woman with silver coils of hair, met Astrid with the easy grace of someone who had seen 1,000 human entrances and exits. She asked to see the portfolio, without the fanfare, and then, with a professional smile, suggested a small showing for local artists. The gesture was practical, a first step that did not require Astrid to step into a spotlight she had not chosen. Audrey learned to sign in bursts, the way children learn a chorus. She would pester Astrid each afternoon at the table, asking for a new sign. Astrid taught her friend, pretty, later, and the sign for family that curled into the soft closure of both hands. In return, Audrey taught Astrid how to make paper stars and how to fold a tiny paper crane, insisting it would bring luck. The child's earnestness was infectious. It turned mundane evenings into rituals. The prize, when it announced its recognition publicly online, carried with it the risk Astrid had imagined. Old colleagues sending polite messages, strangers asking for reproductions, a small flurry of attention that tugged at the edges of her life. Henry helped her draft a short, clear response that said thank you and that she would be in touch about commissions. It was a neat, solid sentence. It did not overpromise. There was a moment several weeks later, lights softened by a December wash, when Astrid stood in a tiny rented studio space, wall space cleared and 3 of her illustrations pinned in tidy measure. She had agreed to a local exhibit that needn't require travel or press. It was an opportunity to show without exposure. Henry and Audrey came, of course. Audrey wore a hand-knitted scarf that mismatched the gloves Astrid had been given, and she clapped with the infectious delight of someone who was not yet jaded by public praise. People circulated, murmured, took photographs with their phones. A gallery owner chatted politely. An older man lingered in front of a piece, one that showed a woman under a canopy of lights, hands upraised, and he sat down in a quiet corner of the room and signed his name to a small guest book. Your work is honest. When the exhibit slowed and the last guests moved on, Astrid found Henry waiting by the door. He held a small envelope. He had a look on his face, the kind of look families have when they are choosing to gift someone with something that matters in ways that can't be itemized. Inside the envelope was not money. It was a note, written in Henry's careful block letters. I'll help with rent this month if you need. No strings. Coffee in the mornings is mandatory. Signed, H. Astrid read it twice. A warmth like soft sunlight uncoiled in her chest. It was not a grand gesture of rescue. It was something more durable, a practical, specific offer that acknowledged weight without commandeering it. She wrote back, "Thank you. I will let you know." She did not want to create a dependency. She wanted to craft a life where exchange was mutual, not mercy from one side and perpetual gratitude from the other. She had seen how such imbalances calcified into obligations and then into resentments. This was different. Henry's offers were the sort that built scaffolding rather than cages. Winter refined into a leaner clarity. There were small domesticities that knitted them into a household of sorts. Audrey's school concerts where Astrid sat proud in the front row with gloves clutched to her chest. A neighbor borrowing sugar and leaving a tin of cookies in return. A storm where the three of them snow-shoveled the stoop together and returned in laughter and wet boots. A calendar on the wall of Henry's kitchen began to gather little circles. Doctor's appointments, audition dates for Audrey, small shows for Astrid. There were no grand pronouncements. There were only the daily acts of showing up. Mugs refilled, a text at night asking if she needed anything, the careful respect for privacy that never felt like distance. They navigated disagreements with pens and notes when words felt too loaded. When Astrid felt the old edges of shame creep in, she wrote them down and handed the paper to Henry like one passes a hot plate. He never tried to fix them. He just acknowledged them and, more importantly, did not pretend to understand entirely. His humility was a steadying force. Months passed. Astrid took a studio of her own after she saved a little from the modest shows and with help from a tiny loan from a community arts fund Henry had connected her with. She taught a weekly class at the library where she showed kids how to use lines to tell stories. Audrey attended once and proudly announced her aunt to the class in sign. The children's hands flapped and tried the shapes, the room filled with visible language. Her relationship with Amanda recalibrated, not reconciled into closeness, but into a practical civil distance. They exchanged notes around birthdays and the occasional holiday. Amanda visited once and left with a small, stiff gift. She did not apologize, and Astrid did not demand one. The lack of melodrama was its own kind of peace. On a late winter evening, as snow reappeared thin and tentative on the sidewalks, Astrid sat in her studio and traced the arc of a hand she had drawn months before. A hand that had learned, in a single night, to be the vessel for an offer that altered the trajectory of a life. She thought of the mall light, of the bench, of Audrey's earnest tug, of Henry's careful signing. She thought of how small gestures had the geometry of dominoes. One motion, and the whole path had changed. She drafted a short note, and then another. She wrote to the judging committee, thanking them, and saying she would be attending a local fair next month. She sent a brief email to a national arts magazine, not to advertise, but to accept the recognition with the dignity she had learned to hold. The responses came in their polite, professional forms. Astrid read each and felt neither overwhelmed nor diminished. She felt capable. On a spring day, before the city had fully thawed, Astrid walked with Audrey and Henry in a park where buds were just beginning to wake. The three of them fell into a small, comfortable rhythm. Audrey chattered in the way children do, fast and literal, about a school play and about a new teacher who had a beard shaped like a question mark. Astrid signed when it mattered and wrote notes when needing to be precise. Henry carried a thermos and 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. They paused by a bench and watched a small flock of pigeons gather crumbs from a passerby. Audrey pointed with great ceremony and signed the word for share, then shared half her sandwich with the gleeful solemnity only a 7-year-old can muster. Astrid laughed, a visible line that reached her eyes. The world was not without its edges. There were still skepticism and small humiliations to navigate, but the day's warmth was lucid and present. Astrid stopped at the bench and put her hand in Henry's. It was a brief, human gesture, neither posed nor dramatic. She squeezed once and then signed simply, "Thank you." He squeezed back and wrote on a spare piece of paper, because sometimes the plain ink of a line holds more weight than the untethered breath of speech. "We'll be here." They sat like that for a while, the three of them, chosen family in the plainest sense, watching a world that moved by its own devices. For Astrid, the memory of the mall's bright canopy was no longer the place where loneliness had rooted. It was the place where a small, decisive motion had led 2 strangers and a child to cross thresholds, into a car while snow hissed, into an apartment with a dimmed tree, into a life that would be made through repeated, ordinary acts of care. When the sky softened into evening and the first stars collected like punctuation, Astrid thought of the certificate tucked in a frame on her studio wall. It was not her anchor so much as a signpost, a record that she made work that could carry meaning in the world. She thought of Amanda, of the cold ledger of family expectations, and of how she had stood steady enough to choose for herself. She drew, late into the night, hands and faces and the arc of small meetings that change fate less by decree than by attendance. Her pencil moved with the steady rhythm of someone who had been given back the right to chart her own course. She thought of the child who had tugged at a sleeve in a mall, and of the single dad who had learned a few signs and then had been patient enough to let a stranger decide. It was not a miracle. There was no abrupt erasure of past pain. There was, instead, the persistent accumulation of small mercies. Hot chocolate handed across a table, a couch offered without strings, gloves knitted with clumsy love, a note that said, "Stay as long as you need." Those small mercies, arranged in sequence, produced a transformation that was quietly radical. Astrid found she wanted to be part of something built on choice, on the principle that care could be a daily practice rather than a headline. She had come to the mall hoping for family, and for once she had dressed as if it might be a real celebration. That night, under the indifferent blink of holiday lights, a 7-year-old's tug and a single father's quiet gesture had redirected a life. Astrid would carry that evening, not as a trophy, but as a tender map of what kindness can accomplish. A place to stand from which to make decisions, to accept help when it respected her boundaries, to create a home that was not defined by bloodline, but by the people who stayed. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with someone who believes small acts can matter. A single kind gesture can, very quietly, change where someone chooses to belong.